Really not liking the sound of that. Are you on direct?
Good morning, everyone. I ask you please to be seated. We're ready to start. Thank you all for being here today, especially those who are going to provide testimony on the revised high-volume hydraulic fracturing regulations proposed by the Department of Environmental Conservation. Whether to allow high-volume hydraulic fracturing to occur in New York is one of the state's most pressing issues. Its impacts will alter our environment and affect our air, water, and the health of our citizens. In light of the importance of this issue, we're holding this hearing to shed some light on many unanswered questions and concerns. Despite the fact that the Departments of Environmental Conservation and Health have declined to attend today's hearing, we urge them to give adequate consideration and attention to the questions and concerns that are raised and discussed today. For the record, we asked the Department of Environmental Conservation and the Department of Health to appear today, but they have declined to do that. We asked the departments to provide copies of information related to their health impact analysis, but so far they have declined to do that. We asked the departments to allow for greater public comment period, and one that didn't include a holiday period on the proposed regulations, but they have declined to do that. We asked the department to make it easier to decipher the revised regulations by reposting the original proposal, but they have declined to do that. We asked the departments to postpone finalizing the regulations and the SGICE until a thorough health impact analysis has been completed, but they have declined to do that. In any event, we are interested in making sure that the public has an opportunity to comment on this issue, and so that is why we are here today. I will thank you all in advance for your patience. We've had a tremendous response to this hearing, and we want to allow everyone an opportunity, everyone who has requested to speak, an opportunity to do so. I will remind you that when it is your time to testify, there is a timer on the table because of the number of people who are participating today. As you know, we have set a time limit of 5 minutes on oral testimony. I would ask, and our experience has been that it's always better if you could summarize your testimony rather than sitting here and reading it to us. We all up here have a copy of the written testimony that is submitted to us, and any written testimony that you give us becomes a part of the official record in that form. If there are some of you here who are not testifying today but subsequently decide that you would like to go on the record in some form or fashion, you should feel free to submit written testimony to us for up to a week from today, and it will be made a part of the official record. You can do that by email or by regular mail. And I will ask my co-sponsors of this hearing, starting with Assemblyman Gottfried, if they have any opening comments.
Yes, good morning. I guess mostly I want to reiterate many of the concerns that Chairman Sweeney raised. We have, in the aftermath of the document, it's not quite clear exactly what it is that was disclosed last week of what purports to be an assessment of the health impacts of fracking. In the aftermath of the disclosure of that document, we called on the administration to suspend the comment period until, first of all of the Freedom of Information Law requests for documents in this matter have been responded to, and secondly, until after the review of the health consequences has been completed by the three-member panel that the Commissioner of Health convened. our feeling is that if New Yorkers are being asked to comment on the fracking regulations, as we should be asked, it is only fair and reasonable that New Yorkers see the whole record and be asked to comment on that. If the commissioners and the governor ultimately are basing their decisions on these documents and analysis, I think it's perfectly appropriate that the people of New York have the same privilege to base their comments and views on the same documents and analysis. In the last several days, it became clear to us, it was stated to us, that neither department was intending to send a representative here, which was not our original impression. While I can certainly understand that while a regulatory judgment is pending, there are many things that it would be inappropriate for either of the two departments, ENCON or Health, to comment on. However, I think it is perfectly appropriate for them to comment and to respond to questions about the process, about the documents that they are relying on, and the analyses that they are relying on. And we wrote to them, the three of us wrote to them yesterday after oral remarks as well, reiterating that proposition, that there are important questions that they can and should properly respond to at this stage in the process, and so far they are refusing to appear. So we are looking forward to the comments of all of you, and with that I'll turn it back to Mr. Sweeney.
Chairman Levine.
Thank you, Mr. Sweeney. Thanks, Chairman Sweeney. Changes in law. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sweeney. Changes in law, especially important changes, will and should capture the attention of many civic-minded people. But changes in regulations generally receive far less attention. That is certainly not the case today. Not in recent memory has there been so widespread and so public a debate on the pros and cons of any given set of regulations. I'm truly impressed by the time and effort that so many of our fellow New Yorkers have invested to learn about and involve themselves in this particular issue, and I think it says a great deal about how vital and how vibrant our democracy continues to be. As Assembly Chairman of the Administrative Regulations Review Commission, or ARC, I'm honored to be able to participate in this hearing. I would like to thank the staff director of ARC, Richard Murphy, for his hard work on this issue and so many issues that otherwise do not receive so much public attention. Today we look forward to learning about how the public has analyzed these revised regulations. I'd also be interested in any suggestions any of you may have about how the process of considering future major regulations could be improved. The importance of regulating activities such as high-volume hydraulic fracturing cannot be sufficiently emphasized. When developing these rules, we must look at how the normal operating procedures of high-volume hydraulic fracturing will affect our environment, and we must at the very same time take into account and fully consider and plan for those potentially catastrophic circumstances when things do not go exactly as planned. Let us look at how these proposed regulations prescribe ways to treat wastewater, the way emergency management plans should work, how and when groundwater should be tested, and many other critically important questions. Civility, reason, and a search for the truth should be the foundation of these proceedings, and I fully expect that they will be. And I thank each of you for attending. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm also pleased that we've been joined today by a number of Assembly members, Assemblyman Ken Zabrowski, Assembly members Barbara Lifton, Ellen Jaffe, Donna Lapardo, Peter Lopez, Mark Butler. And our first witness today is John H. Williams, Groundwater Specialist, U.S. Geological Survey. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. USGS, U.S. Geological Survey would like
Turn
to
your mic
take...
on. Push the mic.
Okay, thank you. The U.S. Geological Survey would like to take this opportunity to highlight a number of science-based practices and characterization, as well as monitoring needs and opportunities that would maximize the understanding and protection of the state's water resources during shale gas development. Valley fill aquifers found in upstate New York are the most important aquifers in the state. Detailed aquifer maps are available in digital format at 1 to 24,000 scale for many of the valley fill aquifers in the southern tier, including Shenango, Broome, Tioga, Chemung, and Steuben counties. These detailed aquifer maps have been developed over decades by the USGS in cooperation with the DEC and form the basis for a consistent and reliable source of information on the spatial extent and framework of these very important aquifers. However, if we look at the southern tier where shale gas development would be most likely stored, there are approximately 375 linear miles of valley fill aquifers that have not been mapped at this scale, at this working scale. Thus, a substantial portion of the area with the highest potential for shale gas development lacks the basic hydrogeologic information needed to assess these aquifers, including their spatial extent. Methane occurs naturally in about half of New York's drinking water wells, but typically at very low concentrations. We've seen elevated methane concentrations has occurred in some water wells in northern Pennsylvania shale gas development sites. The source of this methane appears to be inadequate casing seals, shallow gas that is migrating along annular spacing up and contaminating freshwater aquifers. The industry has surface and intermediate casing cementing programs that are designed to isolate the freshwater aquifer from the shallow saltwater and shallow gas. In northern Pennsylvania, most of the leading companies are now going to a detailed assessment of the first topset well they drill at each one of their multi-well pads. And this includes geophysical logging and mud logging. So in the upper 2,000 feet, this critical zone between our freshwater aquifer and determine where the shallow gas is and where salt water is. So they then can take this site-specific information and design their casing and cementing programs to keep those zones isolated. The Marcellus Shale is overlain by the Tully Limestone and Upper Devonian Shale and Sandstone. These are thousands of feet of relatively low permeability bedrock units that serve as barriers to the propagation of hydraulic fracturings that goes on in the Marcellus Shale. Although these units are relatively homogeneous, there is variability due to their deposition and structural history. There's faulting and folding. Faults are of critical importance, and they cause the most abrupt changes in formation properties, distribution, and potentially affect frac in barrier integrity. Jacoby, who's a noted professor, structural geologist from the University of Buffalo, has studied faults in New York Appalachian Basin and has concluded that they're much more prevalent than previously suspected. So it appears that the integrity of these frac barriers needs to be documented, including that fault distribution. And this can be investigated through geophysical studies, including well logging, seismic reflection surveys, and microseismic monitoring. Microseismic monitoring is a proven technique that the industry used to look at the horizontal and vertical of horizontal fracks while they're fracking. And this can even be done in a real-time nature. Data from the industry from Pennsylvania and West Virginia indicate that, that the height of the maximum height of fracking above the Marcellus decreases with decreasing depth. So at 8,000 feet, you may see a potential microseismic event, a little fault, a little fracture opening 2,000 feet above. But once you're up at about 5,000 feet, the highest potential fracks are about 500 feet above the Marcellus. So this is all well below the freshwater aquifer. However, in New York, when we look at the depths of the Marcellus, hydraulic fracturing may occur at depths of between 3,000 and 5,000 feet. The industry has not collected microseismic data at this shallow depth, so it would seem prudent that they could use microseismic to map the extent of hydraulic fractures during the initial stages of shale gas development in New York, and also in the vicinity of faults. Natural groundwater quality is highly variable in the aquifers over the Marcellus play. Concentrations of contaminants, including chlorides, barium, strontium, radium, may vary by orders of magnitude just between two neighboring wells. With such natural variability, documentation of water quality impacts is virtually impossible unless there's pre-drill information. In northern Pennsylvania, the leading gas companies are now routinely sampling domestic water wells out to 4,000 feet of their water well pads. Obviously, these water well sampling programs are the best interests of private well owners and the gas development companies. But we also must realize that domestic wells are not specifically designed to monitor the potential impacts, and you could actually design a well monitoring network and install it at selected well pads during the initial period of shale gas development to ensure that drilling, casing, hydraulic fracturing practice and operations are adequately protecting the freshwater aquifers. Finally, the amount of scientific data that's being generated by the gas industry during shale gas development is huge. And what we've seen in Pennsylvania is to manage and maximize the potential benefit of this large amount of water quality and hydrologic data during shale gas development, you need a mechanism for electronically reporting, storing, and sharing that information with the scientific community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You worked in New York and Pennsylvania, so
yeah,
could
correct.
you give us a little idea of the role of the U.S. Geological Survey in a state like Pennsylvania where hydrofracking is already taking place, and the extent to which you interact with the industry or the state or the public?
Right, so personally, one of the things that we've done is we've served on a committee that was organized by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection to look at methods to best determine what the base of the freshwater aquifer is. So that's one of our roles. I'm working with the Pennsylvania Geological Survey. We're drilling a number of deep core holes in the Marcellus play area in Pennsylvania and characterizing where's the freshwater, where's the shallow gas, what is that water quality, what is the background water quality, where are these different zones, all related to better characterization of the bedrock aquifer and the underlying shallow gas and salt water. We've also started we have in New York, we've just are completing a study funded by NYSERDA to sample methane in domestic wells. And we were able to sample 60 wells in the southern tier, and we're looking at that and analyzing that data right now to get a good idea of what is the background, what are the processes that control the natural variability of some of these contaminants. Just want to highlight, we were able to sample 60 wells. If you look at northern Pennsylvania, the gas industry has sampled 30,000 domestic wells. So it's a huge database, a huge amount of information that could be of great benefit if shared with the scientific community about our states, about Pennsylvania, and potentially New York's water quality.
It's interesting, you testify about the lack in certain areas, and I guess primarily in the areas most likely to be drilled, of water maps. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering, what are we, by not having those maps, what are we missing? What information do we not have, and why would it be important to us?
Well, the regulations, some of the regulations on the setbacks are based on certain distances from these particular aquifers. And if they're not accurately mapped, then how can you determine what the setback is? We've got a large percentage has been mapped, but there's a substantial part that hasn't been mapped. It would seem that this should be completed in an expeditious way because those setbacks are based on these boundaries. And right now, we don't have accurate boundaries.
So then let me ask you, if drilling were to go forward, and we still don't have these maps, what happens? Do they drill without them? Do they have to do the mapping then before they could do the drilling, or what would take place as things stand right now?
As far as I know, the regulations say that it needs to be discussed and looked at in more detail. So it almost becomes more of a site-specific type of assessment then. So I'm not really sure exactly what the process will be and how this will be determined without these maps.
As you understand it, then there would be nothing in existing or proposed regulations that would prevent a decision to go ahead with drilling without the maps.
Yeah, I'm not aware that it would stop a permit.
Okay. USGS has offered comments on the proposed regulations to DEC?
We have offered comments to the first two rounds. We did not offer comments on this final round.
Is that because your comments were adequately addressed in the first two rounds?
Were what?
Adequately addressed?
I would say many of the comments were, some of them were not.
Are there things that stand out to you that have not been addressed that you would really be up there on a list of concerns?
I think the number of issues that we've just highlighted, including the aquifer mapping, the site-specific detailed assessment of freshwater, saltwater, and gas at these well pad sites, use of microseismic, potential use of well monitoring, a mechanism for managing this scientific information. These are all issues that we came here to, again, highlight.
Well, then let me ask, in your judgment with regard to New York's water resources, are these safeguards that are proposed currently, do they provide, in your estimations, sufficient safeguards to protect New York's water resources?
I would, in my judgment, they go a long way. Again, some of these issues that we've just highlighted, I think we would like to see addressed.
Thank you.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for your testimony. Although I have a feeling a lot of what you've given to us is probably way beyond our personal scientific expertise. I think I know enough to know what of what you said I don't have a clue about, but there may be more of it that I don't have a clue about. The sharing of information that you talked about, I can easily understand the importance of that, and just to reiterate, your concern is that with the proposed regulations is that you do not think there is now enough provision for that?
Correct.
Yeah. Much of the discussion on this topic has focused around the notion that there are mitigation measures that will be proposed, and with those mitigation measures, there will be no danger to human health. Do you, in your judgment, is that true if the mitigation measures that are proposed so far are strictly adhered to? And second of all, in your experience, what is the danger of mitigation measures and regulatory protections being from time to time not adhered to?
I mean, this is an industrial activity, and with industrial activities, there are risks, even if all the protocols and safety practices. So, I mean, there are going to be accidents. I mean, that's been shown in Pennsylvania, and the question is that we need to use the best science and technology to minimize those accidents. Yeah.
You know, I mean, part of my concern is when we're talking about industries of various kinds, industries come and tell us, well, you know, we have as much interest in everything going right as you do, because, you know, if the factory blows up, it's, you know, we're going to have to pay to replace it. And, you know, it's not in our interest as a company if things go wrong. And that, you know, we hear that, but then every so often a coal mine blows up and dozens of miners are killed, and it usually turns out that either the company had been getting violations listed against it for years and years and just paid fines, or somehow there were things that were wrong that didn't get recorded in violations. So am I right to be concerned on that score in relation to gas drilling?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at Pennsylvania's examples, there's been a number of issues. One has been inadequate casing and cementing seals that has caused areas of methane migration. There's been a couple incidences of fracking into abandoned oil and gas, orphaned oil and gas wells. So these are all issues that are all out there. Obviously, the regulators, private homeowners, the gas industry, all want to minimize those, and they're all striving to do that. But they do happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Let me just ask you a little follow-up then. Do they happen, in your estimation, primarily because of a lack of good regulation or a lack of good oversight, or just because stuff happens?
Okay, so one of the issues was how to best case off the shallow gas, and in Pennsylvania, there was only surface casing was required, and intermediate casing was not required, and that was the same in the initial proposed regulations for New York. Since that time, now Pennsylvania and these new New York regulations are requiring an intermediate casing to better isolate those. So that's an instance of the evolution of this industry through time, is a recognition that these more multiple casings to isolate this problem is needed.
So we take precautions, but we learn as we go along.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for your good work and USGS good work for all of us. In Pennsylvania, there have been methane leaks where there have been casing problems.
Right.
What kind of corrective actions can be taken, or has Pennsylvania taken, or has the industry taken, to correct those? How long do those corrective actions take, and how effective are they?
As I previously mentioned, they've added the requirements for an intermediate casing. So the idea is to isolate the freshwater aquifer with your surface casing and cements, and then further isolate the gas, shallow gas, and saltwater with an intermediate casing. So now that has become routine. The other thing that many of the leading companies are now doing in Pennsylvania, they're not required, but they're doing on their own, is this detailed characterization of the first hole that they put at each one of these multi-well pad sites with geophysical logging, drilling, logging, to determine exactly where these zones are so they can best design their system.
And how long do those corrective actions generally take? Can you ascribe a particular time period?
Okay, those are preventative actions that you would do, to try to prevent a stray gas. And essentially, those are the types of things that, would add 4 hours or 5 hours or 8 hours to this whole process. And when you look at it in the long term, it really is a small part of the entire developing that well pad. Now, if they do have stray gas problems and they do have leakage problems, what they end up doing is trying to determine where that stray gas may be coming from, and they actually go into the casing and they perf the casing and they squeeze more cement into those zones. But obviously, it's best to have your initial design work not have to do those sorts of remediation. Once stray gas gets out into the formation, it would, if you could stop the source, I would believe it would, if it was not left to migrate for a long period of time, it should clean up relatively quickly, I would think, for the gas would.
Thank you. Now you tell us that Professor Jacoby has estimated that faults throughout the region that we may be concerned with in New York are far more prevalent than had been imagined or anticipated. And have those faults have not been mapped, I take it?
The Jacoby has produced, and I've have the reference in there in which he has defined many of these faults, and both from subsurface data and from air photo data. The industry, as they develop, collects much more, and he was privy to a certain amount of industry data, but if shale gas is going to be developed, industry will collect much more seismic reflection data and will be able, and will map out these faults. They then will adjust or not adjust their design of their well pads based on where these faults are. So all that information, if open in a more public, other people could assess that, the danger or the possibility of a problem associated with those faults.
All right. And finally, you had advised us that in northern Pennsylvania today, testing is going on at ranges of 4,000 feet from the pads. Now, we know that Colorado has recently, in fact, they've just adopted rules requiring groundwater monitoring. A minimum of 4 wells must be sampled within a half mile of the proposed well pad. All of these tests are to be reported to the state's Oil and Gas Commission and posted on a searchable water quality database that's accessible through the Commission's website and open to the public. Would there be a value, do you think, of that type of approach here in New York and in other states as well?
Yes, certainly domestic water wells are not sited or construction to be groundwater monitoring points. I mean, there's a whole science of installing, designing a monitoring network to assess whether a certain site is contaminating the environment. Domestic well sampling is great, it protects the homeowners, but it is not designed to assess what is the impact on the freshwater aquifer. So it might seem prudent that during the initial stages that a certain number of well pads, a monitoring network that you're proposing for monitoring, looking at both shallow and deep sources, because this industry is sort of unique. We're usually just looking at shallow contamination sources, but in this case, we're looking at both shallow and deep, so you need a specifically designed network to do that.
So a half mile doesn't sound that unreasonable, does it?
No.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We've also been joined by Assembly members Borelli, Abenanti, Kavanaugh, and Crystal Peoples. I think everybody. Any questions on this end? Questions, anyone? Ms. Lifton?
Thank you. If I can get that to work, yes. Good morning. Just a couple of questions. I'm assuming, are you familiar with Dr. Anthony Ingraffia's work from Cornell on well casings and the failure rate of casings and so on?
Many meetings with the doctor.
And you probably know then that he worked for the industry. He's a geologist and an engineer, maybe an engineer. Engineer.
Yes.
Worked for the industry
Right,
for
right.
quite a while. So he's very familiar with the issue of casings and what actually happens in real practice. You probably know that his work says that 6% of the wells fail with the best design, with 2 or 3 casings, fail immediately in the first instance as the well is being drilled. And then over time, I think his numbers are 50% fail over 30 years, I think is his
I'm not sure
data
exact
on that.
numbers, yeah.
It's a pretty dramatic number. And yet, I mean, does that concern you, first of all? And, you know, you talk about the lack of monitoring. The rules still don't talk about monitoring, the drilling and the well casing. How serious a concern is that for you? And you know, 30 years suggests 1 generation, right? We need to be concerned about our water for the next generation. Tell me I mean, I think that's accurate data on Ingraffia's work.
Yeah.
50% failure over 30 years. What kind of failure going forward are you seeing in Pennsylvania? Are you monitoring any of that? And what does that mean for New York if we have 50% failure over time, presumably as the wells are less used, you know, are drying up, if you will?
Right. So then they would be abandoned. So I mean that's you know, the initial assessment that number of wells fail. I mean, obviously, the question is, were they done with both the surface and intermediate casing, and were they used the latest technology? Obviously, proper abandonment after, you know, these wells will have a life of 20 years to 30 years or something. They need to be properly abandoned. There needs to be monies to make sure that they are all properly abandoned, so there's not a legacy of leaking wells. So yeah, it definitely is an issue.
And do you think our rules speak to that issue of abandonment over time? We know from history that there's a tremendous problem with unplugged wells and pollution as a result. What do you see in the current iteration of the rules to address those concerns going forward?
I see major strides in addressing that issue that were not addressed in the past.
Okay.
Still a concern, though.
Am I right? It's not just methane that comes up in the drilling and can mitigate, but other substances that are down in the shale, radioactive substances, barium, strontium, radioactive substances, and others. what is that? And I've heard instances, and maybe you have too in Pennsylvania, of people that have had serious illnesses. 2 cases that I know of, and haven't checked on that in a while, but of barium poisoning that suddenly appeared in healthy young people. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all or have looked at those issues. I keep trying to figure out where the barium, why young healthy people have barium poisoning that were close to fracking operations.
Right. So the question is, barium is a naturally occurring out there, and the question was it related to the drilling and hydraulic fracturing or not? One case that I'm aware of is that there was a domestic homeowner near a site that had elevated barium, and it turns out that the USGS had just happened to sample that person's neighbor 20 years ago, and they had elevated barium before there was any activity in there. So it is naturally occurring. So you really need the pre-drill information to find out whether or not it is actually related to the shale gas development or not.
Because a neighbor has natural barium, does that mean you do, that your water supply?
No. So what it says is there was natural barium in the groundwater in that area. It's not saying 20. It was there 20 years ago. It's there now, and what it's saying is it's not necessarily related to the shale gas development.
But it could be.
But it could be, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So, but without that pre-drill information from that well before all this happened, you're not gonna know what's natural and what's been caused.
We just basically don't have good information out of Pennsylvania. Would you say that's true? That the industry came in and started drilling, and there was almost very little preparation in terms of getting any kind of baseline data. We don't have good studies coming out of Pennsylvania.
Right. So what happened initially? They were just sampling, say, within 1,000 feet or 500 feet. And sometimes not sampling at all. And then some of these issues arose. So now it's very common practice for many of the companies to sample out to all the domestic wells within 4,000 feet. It's in their best interest, and it's obviously in the best interest of the homeowners as well.
Just one very quick question. We also hear that there are lots of people signing non-disclose agreements in Pennsylvania in order to get water to drink when their supply has gone bad with fracking nearby. Again, Washington County, Pennsylvania has been cited with lots of families having water, literally hundreds of families having water delivered to them. But again, most people have signed non-disclose agreements, also some in Susquehanna and Bradford counties closer to us. Are you, when you're on the ground and you're looking at water issues and you're talking to people, do you have any sense of this problem and the dynamics of it, and again, the lack of real reporting we have on what's really happening?
Yeah, I don't have a good feel for that, for what percentage of people are just signing non-disclosure and what percentage are reported. So no, I don't have a good feel for that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Mr. Butler?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony. I just have a couple quick questions relating to regulations. My first question is, what geological characteristics are these gas companies looking for when they site a well or a wellhead? In other words, you've got this layer of rock, can they essentially drop a pipe anywhere and they're going to hit the gas, or is there some specific characteristics they're seeking out?
Right. So the difference between these unconventional, the shale gas versus a more conventional sandstone or carbonate rock reservoir is that these shale layers are largely continuous. Okay. And if the shale is there, the black shale is there, which it is largely a quite continuous unit, the gas is going to be able to release by hydrofracking. So it's a different case where in most cases they can sink it almost anywhere within where the depth is right and the black shale is. Now, as I mentioned, there is some changes due to faulting and the more subsurface information, the more we realize it's more complex than originally assessed. Originally, they thought they could sink a well anywhere, but I've heard off the record from gas companies saying, oh, well, that valley really is not good, and so they can't go anywhere. But they have more leeway in the siting than in typical.
That gets my question. So
Yep.
there is some latitude on where to site a well then?
Exactly, and now that they have the ability for directional drilling and horizontal drilling, the well pad itself, much more leeway in where that can be sited as well.
Now, in the regulations that are being developed here in New York State, there are certain setback requirements, I think, that are being proposed, and as I understand it, they're more stringent than in other areas. Have you had a chance to review those? Do you feel those are adequate? Do you think they're effective? I mean, I guess from waterways and aquifers and things, there are regulations that I think are being proposed in the New York State's regulations. Have you had a chance to review those?
Yeah, I mean, the setbacks largely are to protect the contamination from surface sources, overland runoff, shallow groundwater flow. And I haven't assessed them in detail, but largely given a certain setback, there will be effective in protecting the waterways.
Okay.
I always see the bigger concern as these deeper potential sources. And in those cases, where we're talking about potential contaminant movement over thousands of feet, it's got to be better information in the subsurface that is applied and designed casing installations to protect that. But from a surface point of view, the setbacks of 500 feet or so are adequate for the shallow contamination. The deeper contamination is something that needs to be addressed by applying the best science and technology to the casing and installation programs.
Finally, we talked about failures of wells. Would the emergence of methane constitute a well failure?
Right. So if you start seeing methane in surrounding domestic wells, that would be termed a failure.
That would be a failure, and that
on their concern, and the industry would need to address that. And the perfect scenario is that you have pre-methane sampling for those wells, and you show, yep, when you went in. And this has been very interesting, as people are all concerned about a hydraulic fracturing down at 5,000 feet or 6,000 feet. A number of instances that I'm aware of is that the methane migration occurred before any of the wells were even hydrofrac'd.
Okay.
So it's this initial penetration of the couple top 1,000 feet that is really the critical, and getting the casing and cementing seals in those to protect the water resources.
Okay, now, and we had talked about percentages of well failures and those type of things. In your experience in Pennsylvania, and I believe you said West Virginia, have there been wells that have been forced to close because of methane contamination in the immediate area that you're aware of? Is it fairly prominent? A few? Do you have any assessment of that?
Right. I've really been keeping track mostly of northern Pennsylvania, and we're talking about a handful of incidents in which there was a thought that there was methane migration, and the companies were told that you need to start doing this and this and this. Flaring well, there was flaring wells, perforating and squeezing suspect casings, and so on.
Okay.
And when you talk to the industry, and it's always, well, I shouldn't say that. A couple of examples that I know of, they said that these are wells that were put in with not the standards that they're doing today, that these are ones that they bought out a certain company, the ones that I'm familiar with, and they said they're not happening in our wells today. So there's definitely been an evolution. There's been a four-year experiment going on in northern Pennsylvania that a lot of things have occurred and a lot of lessons have been learned.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. Lopez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for joining us today. Just a few questions, if I may, and again, all of us continue to learn on this issue, and clearly, as we all know, a very sensitive issue for many across the state. In regard to the regulations that I'm still learning as we go along, is there any significance to the impact of karst terrain on fracking or harvesting methane or harvesting the shale gas?
Yeah, definitely. So if you have a karst terrain, instead of having relatively solid shale and sandstone in these limestone terrains, you have the potential for dissolution of the limestone. And of course, the ultimate is something like Howe's Cavern, where you have huge solutions. So you have very small solution cavities to something like Howe's Caverns. So obviously, to drill, to adequately case and cement a well in that sort of terrain is very, very difficult. So what we want to look at is the distribution of those limestone units in New York relative to shale gas development. And those units those bedrock units have been mapped, and we know their distribution. And it turns out that they essentially are largely north of the Marcellus play area, but may touch up on, depending on how far north they go, may be in the Utica play area. So I would say it's not a concern in the initial Marcellus development, but later on, as development may or may not go further north into New York, we reach that carbonate, that limestone that's susceptible to karst development.
In that regard, is there any effective treatment or acknowledgement of karst terrain in the DEC regs?
I'm not aware of that there is.
Okay. Second question, if I may. I've heard many make reference to the depth to the Marcellus as a limiting factor in harvesting shale gas. Is that accurate? Is that an accurate statement? And how does that play out?
Right. So at a certain point, it's not economically feasible to recover gas from the Marcellus, because if you're too close to the surface, there's going to be certain zones in which the gas essentially has already migrated and migrated up into the atmosphere naturally. So there's a certain depth, and the number that I've heard by most people is 3,000 feet. And if you do that 3,000 feet in the Marcellus, essentially it catches Broome County and the southern part of Shenango County in an east-west line. So north of that, it's unlikely that there will be development of the Marcellus shale.
Okay, I'm just trying to just geographically just zero in on what you just described. So the Marcellus has been described as hitting a broad region, and part of my district, including Otsego, Delaware, Schoharie counties.
Right.
So in that regard, again, at some point it tails off and blends into other formations, and you're suggesting that there's a certain depth at which it becomes impractical and feasible
to recover it. However, for example, in Otsego County, and there's already been exploration for the Utica shale in Otsego County, that's at a greater depth. So the Marcellus likely would not be exploited in Otsego County, but the Utica shale, there's a potential for the Utica shale in Otsego County.
Correct. Thank you. Chairman, thank you. One last question. In regard to the abandonment, can you describe what constitutes effective abandonment of a well?
Right. That's really not my expertise, but it's laid out in that you essentially are cementing that well completely in from bottom to
So you're just injecting cement into the drill hole and sealing it off?
Right, exactly, yeah.
And in terms of abandonment, is that an effective strategy over time? based on what we heard from our other colleagues, in terms of protecting against leakage and future contamination?
100% no. But, you know, it's the method that's used and goes a long way, but it's not 100%.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. Appreciate you being here. Thank you.